Untold Stories is a conference started in 2019 by Startup Europe Networks and Startup Hungary. We believe founder stories are powerful, and we pride ourselves on having real, no BS conversations to inspire and educate our community. Building off of our offline events, we developed this podcast with TechCamp Global to bring you untold stories from the region's best founders year-round. In each episode, we try to uncover the details and hands-on tactics behind the founders' successes so you can skip their mistakes and benefit from their years of experience and lessons learned. Our hope is that you will be able to find new ways to accelerate your growth. Let's dive in. My name is Mary Alcantara, and this is the Untold Stories podcast. Szabolcs Nagy is the CEO and co-founder at Turbine. Turbine was founded for a simple reason: to understand complex cancers better than existing experimental tools in order to solve unmet oncology needs. The Turbine team unites computer science and molecular biology with the world's most intricate simulation of cell behavior to identify treatment options for the 70% of cancers that are currently unexplored. Earlier this year, they raised a €5.7 million round led by Excel Partners, which we'll talk more about. Today, Szabi will share his journey with Turbine, how they're innovating in the biotech space by applying the lessons learned from his days growing SaaS companies, and just putting Hungary on the global deep tech map. Thanks for joining us, Szabi.
Thanks for having me.
So the first question we ask all our founders is, what made you want to become an entrepreneur?
That's a long story, but I think the summary is I did not want to become an entrepreneur. I sort of grew into one. Luckily, your university years, I helped build a student organization, and that was the first time that I actually realized I like building things and I like figuring out problems. And even though my father actually was an entrepreneur, I never actually wanted to take over the family business. I never wanted to do that. But during the student organization, I realized, yeah, this is actually fun. And then actually another, let's say, very successful, I'd say one successful, I'm not there yet, right? But one very successful startup founding team asked me, the folks from Trezorit, to help them grow them actually when they got started. And that was a super great opportunity. I mean, I was with friends. I really liked doing it. It was really hard, and it definitely tested my abilities. And I think at one point, that was actually part of my story. That organization outgrew me as somebody who could be, who could lead the growth part of that story. But that taught me a lot of very valuable lessons about, where my limits lie and what I'm really interested in doing. And I knew I definitely wanted to build a startup, but I also sort of got to as a question, what I would like to work on, what kind of problem would I like to solve? And I realized actually it could be one of three things. Either I help the poor in a way, I help the sick, or I would love to go to space. And when I analyzed those problems, I realized that likely it's the middle one that's going to really work out with some kind of, let's say, technological startup. And so I started looking around for opportunities, and I met my co-founders at that point. And the whole story grew from there.
So was Trezorit your first job out of university?
I had, at one point in time, I did want to go into management consulting, and I think most everybody who is driven and goes to, some kind of business school.
We all make that mistake.
Yeah, definitely a mistake, But I did start out as an intern at management consultancy, and then luckily Giorgio, who's one of the founders at Trezorit, he saved me from that fate by asking me whether I wanted to come over to them.
And how many people were working there at the time when you joined?
That's a good question. I think it was roughly let's say 10 people.
And when you left?
60, I think.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I love that humility that, it was something that, you went as far as you could, and then you felt like the organization outgrew you, and it was a time to move on and, learn and develop elsewhere. I think that's something we see, there can be conflicts, I guess, when people don't have that self-awareness to kind of see where...
Oh, no, we definitely had a conflict, but I think that's part of it, right? That's part of it.
Yeah, cool. And helping the sick. Did you ever think about being a doctor? Or
It would have been so nice, but I kind of knew, even when I went to university, my big problem was that I was just too excited by too many things. That's been my curse. all the time, because it sounds nice, but actually what it means is that you can't really stick to anything too long. You're a bit like ADHD, right? I mean, you're constantly switching focus, and that's why I did want to go to engineering or to become a doctor. But then, since I couldn't pick on the exact last day of sort of selecting university, I basically said no. I need to go for something that's much more generalistic, and I went to business school for that reason. So, anyways, I did not go in that direction, but I had this drive to try to help others. And luckily, I had a couple of friends who knew people who were doctors, and that's how I met the co-founders, Turbine.
So I heard that you call the co-founding team the tripod in Turbine.
Yeah. That's sort of part of the specialty of the company in a way, because we're trying to solve a problem that is very much, let's say, a medical problem, right? I mean, we're trying to understand cancer in new ways, but we're trying to build engineering solutions to that problem in a way. So not a typical way of trying to understand disease using biological experiments. We are building a technological tool to help us do that. So we needed two types of different capabilities. We needed sort of the medical and biological, as well as the software development, the machine learning for us. And then I brought sort of the third aspect in, which is let's just try to figure out what the hell is the real problem to solve in a way, because the team, and I'm sure we can talk more about that, was very science first. So it was two PhD students doing really wonderful research, but not actually having a problem to solve. And that was an interesting sort of situation where you have a cool tool, a cool idea, but not the real problem, the real commercial, let's say, goal to solve. And so I was basically in charge of trying to figure that one out over the years, and it has evolved a lot, I can tell you. So that's why we had, let's say, three very complementary skill sets and worldviews that were all needed to succeed. And so for a long time, actually, we were basically completely equal in terms of decision making, in terms of how we make, how we call basically the future of the company, how we decide resource allocation and where we go. We all always strived for consensus, because we felt none of us had the right answer, but together we may have or may be able to figure it out.
So Chris and Daniel, these are the other two members of the tribe, of the tripod.
Absolutely.
And so they were the researchers that had the kind of original idea. So maybe tell us the kind of origin story of Turbine and when you joined the story.
Yeah. So the original idea, I think for Krish, he's the engineer, let's say. I mean, he's an extremely smart scientist and a software developer, machine learning expert, mathematician. So that's where he was coming from. But he wanted, because of his own personal story, he wanted to understand cancer better. And basically he felt, this is a disease that's impacting so many of us, but we have, to simplify it, we have no idea, what causes it in most cases, and we have no idea how to treat it. And he had some painful stories related to this. So he wanted to understand this as a system, and that's where he was coming from. And Dani, he's a trained medical doctor. He used to practice, but he did his PhD in systems biology. So he also wanted to look at biology, disease as a system to be understood. And so they met during their PhDs in Péter Csermely's lab, which was one of the leading sort of network science labs in Hungary at the time. And so what they together wanted to do is figure out a way to simulate cells, let's say build a cell simulation. And they had a whole other bunch of ideas, actually. So when I met them, they already, let's say, figured out that they wanted to spin out of university, and they wanted to build a company to really commercialize this, because they felt that it had a lot of potential that other approaches did not have in understanding biology with some kind of software development or engineering approach. But they didn't really know where to head to. And so when I became part of the story, as we discussed, what I initially did is basically crush some of their dreams, because they when we, for example, met to brainstorm on, what is the use case that we want to solve with this approach. And I brought, I think, like 2 types of Post-its and like maybe 3 whiteboard markers because I thought that's going to be enough for the 6-7 ideas we have. And then in the end, we had a matrix containing 70 plus use cases across different industries, from like ecological footprint prediction all the way to telecommunication network optimization, all the way to simulating cells. And then
this is what happens when you get an engineer and researcher and business person to get too many ideas.
Absolutely. And so basically what I said was, listen, the one thing I learned at Tresorate, if there was one thing, it was that we can only do one thing right, and we need to do that one thing right. So out of the 70 things, it's one that we need to pick.
Wow. And this is where you got to using the cell simulator for
basically
cancer?
Saying, yes, let's focus on cell simulation. So building a network model of a human cell that we can simulate, basically bring to life and use as you would use any experimental model in a lab, basically. And this is the same thing. It's just a computational model of a human cell, which means that you can run experiments at speeds and costs and scales that are feasible only with computation and would never be possible experimentally, which means that you can find things and test things that you would never be able to test experimentally. Thus, you find novel ways of treating cancer, and you basically know more about your predictions. And I can talk more about this if you guys want to dive into it. But in general, I'd say it gives us an edge over the competition because we just better understand the problem we're trying to solve all throughout the very long process of designing and discovering a new drug.
Yeah, we can definitely go into the tech a little bit more in a second, but I love just how you're talking about it, and that's, I think, what you brought to the table, looking at the problem we're trying to solve and having this kind of, I guess, startup, product market fit approach to the whole story. And I think, for you, biotech, this was a completely new space, a big shift. So yeah. How was it? I mean, now you're, obviously fluent in this, lingo, and you're comfortable in this sector. But how was it for you to adjust? What kind of, maybe talk to us about that transition.
I think this is where, the curse that I mentioned earlier, which is just I'm very excited about new stuff, really came into play because from the first day, what I knew was that this is a really big problem we're trying to solve, and the guys have some really exciting science, but I didn't have any idea about molecular biology. I didn't know anything about machine learning, network science. So I just basically started asking a whole host of questions, and we spent a year trying to really figure out the use cases that we discussed, the problem to solve, and also trying to map out, how, what is the biggest hurdle, let's say, to solving that. And one of the problems was that, we were just a bunch of guys basically crammed into a one-man room in university at Semmelweis, and we had zero contact with pharma. So we knew that if we are to help design better drugs and help better understand cancer, we likely need to find out more about that. And so that's something that I could really help drive because I, went to town to try to figure out how to get closer to pharma. We found Bayer's innovation program at the time, which we used as sort of a backdoor to be able to move out to Berlin and work for half a year very closely with a whole host of folks at Bayer. And basically, even then, it was mostly customer development, as you say. It was almost like figuring out product market fit. It was just that we were trying to find something we called the killer experiment in a way. So to try to show that, in one sort of use case with one, let's say, experiment, try to show that this technology has merit. That was really what we were trying to figure out. And then all the work with Bayer, all the discussions there really helped us actually uncover a whole host of potential use cases and to test the tech in all of these use cases and start racking up some early proof points that we can actually predict how cancer cells behave, and we can actually find novelty that the pharma folks would not actually be able to identify otherwise. So that's really what helped us. And that was the first 2 years, basically, of the company's life.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of good stuff here that I want to get back to, but maybe let's jump into this idea of the killer experiment, because as we were talking about just now before we pushed record, product market fit and traction in the biotech space is a bit different. So maybe you can kind of tell us a little bit let's talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So the challenge for such a company as us is that there's a core sort of research risk to your endeavor. So it's not just about can you build good enough tech, and can you find the right customers, and then can you grow your pipeline, let's say funnel, fast enough. It's primarily about can you even solve this problem with the approach that you're taking. And so everybody is really excited about the idea. People have called this the holy grail of biology, a computational model of human disease. But people are also cognizant of the fact that a lot of extremely smart people have spent decades trying to solve this problem, and they haven't really come up with anything so far. So then the very clear question everybody, both potential partners in pharma as well as investors, asked us was, what is the proof that this can really happen? And to us, it was actually part of the reason that we started simulating cancer cells, particularly because in cancer, without becoming getting too technical, you can simulate behaviors relevant in cancer more easily than, let's say, neurodegenerative disease or immunological disease. And it's a simpler
more predictable,
problem.
Or
it's a simpler problem because you can simulate a single cell and how it goes wrong, basically how its decision-making processes go wrong. And that's really what cancer is, ultimately a cell going haywire. And then it grows out from that, obviously, and it's then many cells in many different ways going wrong, but the first thing can be boiled down, or many cancers can be boiled down to, let's say, what goes wrong in the single cell or on the single cell level. So once we were able to show that we are predictive of simulate, let's say, biological models of cancer, which are just petri dishes filled with a single form of cancer cells, we were able to show that, if we simulate, let's say, a drug being administered to our simulated cells, that those basically start behaving in a similar way as it's observed in experiments. And that was really the killer experiment for us. Like, as soon as the Bayer folks saw that, they said, we've tried to build this in-house 5-10 years ago, and it never was predictive. And they were very cognizant that it's early predictivity. It wasn't like an extremely clear signal, right? It wasn't like, oh my God, we've never seen this. But that's because it takes a lot of time to make this tech work, and a lot of effort. And so even the first signs of predictivity were very compelling and allowed us to really get the company off the ground.
So you were able to do what Bayer's own R&D team couldn't 5 to 10 years ago.
That's what they told us. Yeah. That's what they liked about us.
And so you were there with them in their incubator program, basically?
Yeah. They called it the G4A. I mean, it was pretty funny. We were crammed into the back end of nowhere, really, in the Bayer campus in Berlin.
So you moved from Semmelweis, quiet dark
to
room
the
in Semmelweis to the same thing,
setting in Berlin. Yeah, it was really funny because, it's a very different world. Obviously, people usually leave at 5:00, and the whole Berlin campus was just really looking at us in a weird way when we were still there at 2 a.m. Every day, basically. We even brought our own training equipment. Like, I brought my little gymnastics rings and hung them from the stairwell, and I had to hide them when the security guys were coming around. So it was a very different sort of atmosphere that we brought to Bayer. But the good thing was that we sort of, got over the firewall in a way, and we could position ourselves as, we're here with you guys, we're part of the team basically at Bayer. And so can we ask a lot of questions? We have a non-disclosure agreement, which is very important. So we'll just ask a whole bunch of questions about, your problems as a scientist and where your tooling, fails you, basically. And that's the type of information that helped us figure out, again, the use cases that we mentioned earlier.
So you were there on site for 6 months, but your collaboration with Bayer lasted
much longer. Yeah. So we spent, I think maybe it was 4 months or so in Berlin. But after that, we spent like the absolute most stressful Christmas waiting for Bayer to sign the agreement with us and start paying us money, because we obviously had zero money at the time, and we wanted to start paying people. And once that really happened, then we were able to, let's say, translate that into other collaborations with other pharma companies. And that was the first 2 years of our life, really focusing on delivering novel ideas for pharma to actually target new patients with their drugs, because they weren't interested in new drugs. They were interested in how do we make more money out of the investment we've already made in these. And we did that for 2 years, but that taught us a lot about why that's not the right business model in this space, for example.
So these early projects were kind of almost like consulting projects, right? Where you're using your technology to help kind of come up with do ideation for these.
Absolutely.
How did that shift over time? So what's the current business model, and how did you get there?
Yeah. So initially our worldview was, we are a simulation company. We know this best. We have no idea about actually discovering drugs, so we'll let the folks who do drug discovery do that, and we'll stick to what we know. But over time, and it was really interesting because the whole field of, let's say, machine learning or computationally enabled drug discovery actually evolved along with us in a way, and it evolved in US-based hubs mostly, somebody in the UK, but everybody started with a similar business model. Basically, it was all about how do we provide a service based off of this tech,
Right.
and the assumption was that if we find something interesting enough for pharma, they'll pay us some of the downstream value, basically, because the problem with drug discovery is that the value of a new idea of treating, let's say, cancer does not grow exponentially or linearly. It follows a step function. So first up, you have a 99 point whatever % chance of failure, and then over time, as you hit later stage milestones, but those milestones may take you years to reach, suddenly now it's 5% chance, and suddenly now it's 10% chance when you've entered the clinic. Suddenly it's 50% chance, but up until the point you hit that, you have no idea whether you'll reach it or not, and you actually still have the 1% chance or the 5% chance of success. And then the problem is that if you provide a simulation-based prediction, it just seems to have zero likelihood of success. And so the pharma partner will always say, this is a great tool. I'll pay you hundreds of thousands of euros to use it, but I will not give you any part of the real value, which is what the drug makes when it actually enters the market. And so that's the core business model challenge that we faced early on. And we believe no worries. We'll just scale the company as a service company. Basically, we'll make it easier and easier to onboard new folks and for them to use the simulations, and we'll make a nice business out of that. It's basically a SaaS play. But then the more we understood how much value we're leaving on the table, and also actually just because of the dynamics of this market where you don't have thousands of potential customers, you only have, let's say, dozens or hundreds, suddenly even I, as the guy on the inside, couldn't make the Excel sheet work. So when I was building the Excel sheet to show how valuable this company will be with that business model, it just didn't really work out. And that was obviously a really tough realization for us. And also we started fundraising at the time, and actually we went out to Silicon Valley, spent a lot of time with the top investors in the field who were really excited about the tech, but all of them were saying, listen, this field is very early, but based on the 1-2 companies that are maybe ahead of you guys about a couple of years, who have, for example, this year started exiting and IPOing, they already felt that this was not the right business model. And all of that taught us that we had to completely rethink what we were doing. And that actually led to us saying, we'll have to figure out how to become a drug discovery company, because likely that is what you need in order to have more control over your own fate. Because if you are a drug discovery company, you can trust in your technology. You can say, listen, these simulations make sense, so I'll invest into the discovery of novel therapeutics based on my own ideas coming from the simulations. And when you have a drug, nobody cares where it came from. It's a drug and it has comparables, and it will be valuable if it, again, hits those later stages. And so that transformation started about 2 years ago.
And are you doing all of that work in-house, or are you working with partners? I mean, because I would imagine developing the capacity to actually do drug discovery and run trials and do all of that, completely different than...
It is a completely different problem than the core simulation. So and it's still an open question to some extent. So what we have started doing is we basically said, listen, we need the capability not just to do simulations, but to do the biological experiments that validate that the simulation makes any sense. So we said that should be part of the platform. That was a major extension of how we see Turbine's core competence. So now the validation is also part of that, and we hope that we'll be raising a new round soon, and that part of that is going to actually be used to help us build out a lab here in Hungary that generates a ton of data for us to validate predictions. So that was part of the capabilities that we built. But beyond that, we also said, we have no idea about drug discovery, so that's why we flipped the company up to a limited in the UK, because we knew that in the UK you do have real drug discovery ecosystem. Here in Hungary, unfortunately, you don't. And so we said, let's go there and let's start finding experienced people to bring into the executive team and the company. And we've started doing that in the past 12, 18 months. But ultimately, we would not want to build out all the capabilities necessary. Then that's also not how biotech really works. Usually you have a core team of experts, and then you work in a virtual setting with a lot of contract research organizations who provide the laboratory services that you need, which are very repeatable, and you really shouldn't be building them out. So we don't see a lot of the capabilities as part of the platform. So we won't be building those, but we will be building and we have been building the expertise in-house to guide those partners to just run the experiments for us.
Yeah, super interesting. And in this case, the drugs that originate from your discovery and validation process, you'll have share in the downstream, basically, because you'll be owning the whole IP from the beginning.
And that's actually, where we come back to your question about how we see ourselves partnering or doing all of this ourselves. So in the current round, for example, I'm having constantly day-to-day discussions now with investors, and it's interesting because some of them say, you should just do it yourself, because we see that the companies who exited, Recursion and Exscientia, are the two that are IPO'd this year, and they've been extremely successful. So they were successful not because they had... Actually, it's interesting because they follow two different routes. One actually built their own pipeline. So they said, I'm owning the drugs, I'm discovering them, I have everything in-house, and I get them into clinical trials, testing on humans. So that was one track. And the other was, I own some of my own drug programs, but I'm still very heavily partnering with pharma companies and owning a small portion of the value of those programs. And both now worked out. So it's an interesting sort of junction for us, because we need to pick for the next, let's say, 2-3 years, which is the model that we want to follow. And apparently both could lead to an IPO in the next, let's say, 2 to 4 years. So it's an interesting question.
Are you still partnering with some pharma and offering your technology?
At this point, no, because actually that was pretty, a very tough situation, because we were making really good revenue out of those interactions. But we realized that if we kept on doing that, that would dilute focus, and we would never be able to really effect this evolution of the company and this pivot into this drug discovery entity. So we had to let go of those and say no to some nice upfront revenue. But we said we needed to do it because we just needed to focus on this.
Because you saw that, the upper limit of that work was
absolutely. And we saw that the upside, as you say, was kept. So we believe that with what we are doing now, we will be eventually partnering, maybe now or maybe later. But in that case, the potential value that we can get from a partnership will be very different, because we'll have validated, as we say, the platform we'll have run the next killer experiment, because we've run the first ones, but can we predict how, let's say, biological experiments turn out? Now the next question is, can we then translate that to novel therapeutics?
We haven't talked about this at all yet, but I'm wondering just if I feel like there could be a social element to what you're doing too, just because you're able to explore cancers that have previously not had any attention, whether I'm assuming it's for cost reasons, right? If there's, if it's a cancer that doesn't affect a huge part of the population, typically pharma won't go after that because they don't see the monetization. Is that part of your vision at all? Like, to be able to really create new therapies for patients that would otherwise have nothing? Because of how, the business model of big pharma, how that's set up.
That's part of it. Yeah. I'd say that the problem for patients with cancer, let's say today, is that on the one hand, we don't understand their disease well enough to have a high chance of really helping them in a lot of the cases. And we basically say that 70% of cancers are too complex for the current experimental approaches to really deconvolute, which means that we don't really know whether the patients who have those cancers, those types of cancers, would really benefit from the drugs, or we may not have the right drugs to benefit them. So that's part of it. The other part is that even if they have a good drug, because cancer constantly evolves, it usually develops resistance to that drug over a certain set period. So very few of the cancer therapeutics are actually curative. And because of that, a lot of the times extremely, pricey drugs are actually not really delivering a lot of benefit for patients. So our real vision is that we want to understand cancer well enough and develop therapies that actually really have durable response, that really do deliver meaningful patient benefit for a particular set of patients who otherwise would not have a recourse. And eventually we do hope that because of the simulations moving the most important, let's say, KPI in drug discovery, which is the likelihood of success. So you don't necessarily want to interestingly cut down on cost or time at any particular point in the process, but you ultimately want to maximize the chance that if you launch something, it will actually work in patients. And that's really one of the, let's say, crucial things we optimize for when we develop the tech. And basically we believe that if that turns out to be true, once we start delivering drugs to patients, then that could actually meaningfully impact the economics. So because the drugs that are getting to patients, let's say most of the drugs that try to get to patients fail. So because of that, you need to price the ones that do get to patients really high to
cover all
basically
that.
cover all that investment. And the idea is that if you fail less, then you can cost less as well.
Cool. So one of our other topics that we like to explore in this series is just the idea of mentoring. I think a lot of founders, have referenced this, that they wouldn't be where they are without having great mentors along the journey. And I know you kind of hinted on this, that this was one of the big things that you started when you first joined the team.
Absolutely.
Kind of building a global mentoring network and getting these connections to pharma. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? I know Bayer was obviously one of the big ones, but who else did you talk to? What else was really impactful for you?
I'd say what really I did was just ask dumb questions all the time from folks. And it turned out that people like answering questions and like somebody, or let's say a team in our case, who are extremely interested in better understanding their world. And that approach has really what led us, from one person to the next, always asking for more references, who else could we talk to, who else could really help us understand this, the business model, the strategy, the problems with drug discovery. And through that process, we got in touch with a lot of people who are leaders globally in drug discovery, in biotech, in building companies, successful companies in this space. And those are really the connections that helped us actually learn a lot. And I think just the humility of saying, we really don't know. I mean, a lot of this, as we discussed, right, we were not drug discoverers, so we just were very open about that. And we said, listen, we don't know, but we want to learn. And the more we talked to these guys, the more relevant our questions became, and the more, more tidbits we could, or little crumbs we could throw in there that really showed that we actually start understanding this problem. For example, in Bayer, I mean, we saw that, after the first 10 discussions, we actually sometimes better understood some of the problems that they were facing than themselves, or we knew about internal, topics that were keeping them up at night. And so obviously that understanding really started, that network effect started playing into our hands after a certain point in time.
So basically you started out asking dumb questions, but because I was going to say, how did you get people's attention, or how did you get people to spend time with you? So I think maybe those first conversations were, where you learned a ton and validated a lot of your knowledge, and then you were able to ask better and better questions and have more interesting conversations with people later on.
Absolutely. And I think just people let's say, liked the trajectory of the company. I mean, that we were coming from such an orthodox, let's say, background and geography. And I think it was also very important for us that we didn't really, I'm not going to say waste time, because that's harsh, but we didn't try to really do this at home. We just felt that there wasn't really the right ecosystem here for such a deep tech company, especially in biotech, to really learn and succeed. And so we just basically skipped getting bogged down in the local ecosystem and went straight to international ecosystems and hubs where people actually really have succeeded at the problems we were trying to solve.
On changing this, right? So putting Hungary on the global deep tech map, right? So
yeah, that would be, let's say, that's the hidden vision, right? I mean, we all feel like how different it is when we again spend time in whatever, London, Cambridge, Oxford, Silicon Valley, but we never feel, I'm sure many of us feel this way, right? We never feel that somebody there is better than us. I think it's just that they have a very different, let's say, set of starting resources to build on. And that's why I believe if we do a good job, and some of the other companies that are trying to build, let's say, more deep tech plays here in Hungary do a good job, then hopefully 10 years out, others will be able to at least build on the initial successes and have some of the connections, some of the network effects that we've built up.
Absolutely. So let's talk about your fundraising. I know you just closed a big round earlier this year and you're fundraising now, but let's start at the beginning. You started out with an angel round, right? So just tell us.
Yeah. So when we went to Berlin, we actually, that goes along with asking the dumb questions. We went to an ML meeting, and there was a really interesting guy there who was running a machine learning company, and I asked him a bunch of dumb questions, and he liked them. So I got to spend some time with him in some Berlin bars, and then he put us in touch with one of his own investors. I mean, he was getting closer to his own exit, but he put us in touch with a really crazy but actually really well, let's say, regarded investor called Atlantic Labs, and they are doing basically seed rounds, or in that case it was mostly like an angel round, a couple $100,000. And they were extremely crucial because they brought a really well-developed network that then actually got us the next round when we wanted to really start raising. But once we figured out that the drug discovery play is something we need to do, and we understood that we'll just need to start raising for that because it's more capital intensive. So that opened the doors to London for us. And eventually those London doors basically opened the Excel doors for us. So that's the history, I think, really. The seed round we closed in 2019. I mean, that was very difficult in a way because we, as I mentioned, I mean, basically realized the error of our ways and the need to reshape our worldview, right? I mean, to move from the service play to the drug discovery play midway through the fundraise, which I think we started in like 2018, and then it took us a year basically to close that round, maybe even more in a way. So obviously that was a very tough time because we, on the one hand, needed to, we started 2018 with this whole dream that, we'll close a great round and really build out the service business. And then we realized, okay, that's not actually going to work. Then we needed to, on one hand, be very honest with the team that, actually we messed up here, or like, we learned a lesson, right? But that lesson is going to be painful, and we'll need to really do a lot more to actually manage to raise the seed round, which we eventually did because we were lucky enough to find a team that was looking for just the type of plays that we are. So completely, crazy plays that are trying to completely rethink a lot of the, let's say, assumptions and dogma around, in this case, drug discovery. And those guys, the Delian folks who we raised from in 2019, they really helped us think deeply about how do we go about building this drug discovery play. And because we did that, we actually got in touch with a lot of other experts that the Delian folks brought into the mix. So they were really smart money in the, absolute best way of the word. Mm-hmm. And those connections then actually allowed us to close Excel.
So how much did you raise in the seed round?
The seed was about 3 million euros, and then this last one was 5.6. So altogether there is about 10 so far.
And I know, typically, for software, it's a bit maybe more straightforward. Or, when you go for a VC round, there's usually milestones kind of attached to, okay, if you this money will get us this much runway, and by that point we'll have this achievement so we can go out and, raise the next round. Yep. With, your space with biotech, I mean, it's so capital intensive. It's how do you, I guess, and having that narrative when you're talking to VCs, and having that change halfway through, I can imagine that was tricky, but, and you're raising now again, right? Yep. So maybe you can tell us a little bit. Yeah. So now we know a little bit more about the direction that you're moving into this drug discovery space. Now it's quite
fine. I mean, basically, there are, let's say, as I mentioned, two directions forward, right? I mean, you could raise more and do your own drug discovery, or you could raise a bit less, but still significant amount, and try to go more for partnerships. Mm-hmm. This is really the junction at which we are, and both are actually viable options. So we're looking at, VC response and also just looking at what we believe is possible to determine the right way forward. But I mean, when we raised the seed, for example, it was much less clear. I mean, we had ideas, potential directions, potential ways to utilize the technology to help drug discovery, but we had, at that point in time, 0 proof points that this would work. So that's why, obviously, that round was extremely difficult to raise, because we had proof points, but those were to support a different narrative and a different story. So what we really actually helped us was the killer experiment that I talked about. Mm-hmm. So some of the work we did with pharma actually generated, let's say, insights into a problem that one of the venture partners with Delin at the time when he was a leader at AstraZeneca, one of the big pharma companies, he actually spent millions on trying to solve that problem, and he never could. And we just brought a case study and walked him through how we actually managed to find something really meaningful here for that big pharma company that we were working with. And he was completely astounded. Like, okay, this took me years and I didn't get anywhere. So that core sort of killer experiment, those core proof points were what actually saved us at that point in time. But obviously now it's much more about, we have much more momentum. We know what the right KPIs are to optimize for. So when we closed the round with Excel, which was, let's say, end of last year, we actually were able to plot a course that we believe would be, logical to really support this narrative. Like we wanted to find new drug targets. We wanted to show how productive and efficient the platform is. We wanted to show that we have the right capabilities to really do drug discovery by bringing in a couple of experienced veterans, which we've done. So this was now much more logical.
So you talked about how the guys at Dellin really just understood what you were trying to do on the technology side, and you had this killer experiment and these proof points. So basically you could show that you've been able to do what the big pharma like Bayer hasn't in the past, and even AstraZeneca. How important is it to have a VC that really understands what you're doing?
I think in deep tech it's extremely important because even during this current fundraise, I'm speaking to some of the leading VCs in the US who have actually, there's not many VCs at this point who have actually had exits in this space because we've only had those few that I mentioned. But the VCs who invested in those companies early and I speak to, it's very clear how their views differ from somebody who's maybe newer to funding a computationally enabled biotech play. And so, or just in general, deep tech. And so what I hear from the really smart VCs is that they don't really care about, partnership track record. They don't care about, they don't ask about revenue. They care mostly about really what is that problem that nobody else can solve and you can solve. That's the first thing to figure out. And then the next thing is how can you turn that into, how can you industrialize that? How can you generate enough value? Does it need to be a drug discovery play? Do you need to own your own assets or is it a different route? And so that's, I'd say that's why it's very important to have somebody who really thinks with you. And the Dellin folks, for example, have been absolutely that for us because they understood the vision as well as we did. And they had the same vision. They shared the same vision. And they did not want to force, partnering or something else on us or a particular business model that may not have been the right way to capture the value of that vision and the tech itself. And they've been very integrated into our thinking about, again, the business model. So I think you need somebody who is willing to say, let's put the vanity metrics aside that are easier to understand, and let's try to really drill into what you need to prove and then ultimately what you need to become. And you also need to be very, let's say, open to maybe saying, oof, this didn't work out, maybe because of the business model has shifted, maybe because the market now values these companies differently based on different metrics. And you need to say, okay, we need to drop all what we've done and take the core tech and use it in a different problem.
Yeah, really interesting. And you said Dellin was the one that connected you to Excel.
Yes. No, actually, it was the Atlantic guys, but it was a really good blog post that the Dellin guys, Jonathan over there, who's our partner, he wrote about why he believes in Turbine, and that actually that has netted us, I think, 2 term sheets so far. That blog post.
Wow, yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, great example about how a VC can really just help the journey with their companies. Cool. Where are they based?
It's a global firm,
okay.
But these guys are in India because they do the global health investments.
Okay. Did you ever look for capital in Hungary?
We did last year. We did mostly because we actually started fundraising right when COVID was hitting. So it was in a way, it was ultimately a really good time for us because it actually made borders evaporate. And so we got investment from a team that was not actually looking, I think, that particularly at Europe, definitely not Eastern Europe to find the next investment for them. But they were looking at these types of companies and mostly, let's say, in the US. So suddenly we became, as relevant as anybody in the East Coast or on the East Coast or the West Coast. So that was good. But we started raising during the COVID times. And for a while, obviously, I just basically wanted to make sure that we have the absolute best chance at raising. And that means that, you can't, I don't know, you can't say no to any potential direction. So we did talk to some Hungarian VCs. Basically, what we learned was there are some really good ones. So I really enjoyed some discussions. Day one guys, I think, are really smart, and I like them. But in general, what we saw was that most VCs are not thinking about funding such a play at all, because they understand, I think, the SaaS plays. They understand software. This is a business model that is, I'm not going to say they don't understand. They just are thinking about it in a different way compared to the Western VCs, where they're saying, this is a risk that I don't want to take on. Whereas a lot of Western VCs have actually built funds around the thesis of biology and technology now.
Yeah, and like you were saying, we don't have a huge precedent or industry expertise here about this.
So it all makes
Hungary.
sense, right? I mean, we're great at software. We're not yet great at this. So it's all understandable. But that's why I really do hope that we and a few others succeed, and others who are trying to build deep tech companies here in Hungary can actually do it. Because, I mean, we have all the makings for it, right? I mean, we have still good technical talent and good scientific talent that actually doesn't really have, I mean, that's in a way optimal for us at Turbine, because unfortunately there are no real alternatives a lot of the times for somebody who, let's say, studies biology in Hungary and doesn't want to spend their time in academia, or doesn't want to go abroad. So unfortunately there aren't a lot of alternatives, which is good for a deep tech company trying to solve this problem, because we get to have great talent that everybody who comes from the US and is on board, or works from us from the UK as an experienced biotech executive that we brought into the company, they're all amazed by the team we have and the quality and the number of people and the price we pay for them. So that's something that we can definitely benefit from, even though the lack of an ecosystem is a hindrance.
And yeah, like you said, maybe in a few years, you'll be leading the charge with a fund or some kind of opportunities for more.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what we think a lot about with the tripod.
Yeah. Awesome. And so let's talk a little bit more about the team then outside of Tripod. So how many people do you have now?
Currently about 60.
60. And is most people here in Hungary?
Absolutely. I mean, the tech team, basically the platform team is here. And we've also managed to snag a couple of actually good drug discovery related talents in the past year. And we only are building the executive team currently and the drug discovery, let's say, heavy capabilities in the UK, but everybody else is located here in Budapest.
So Hungary and the UK.
Yeah. I mean, we interestingly have been hiring a lot of Hungarians who left Hungary because they didn't see any alternatives here and are now happy to rejoin, but they're working from Vienna, Spain, and a couple other places.
And how do you manage everybody? Obviously remote work is a big topic since COVID, but I guess your plan is to have the headquarters, the base here in Hungary for the time being. And how is it to kind of, manage the people who are working in other locations?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I won't rehash anything that I'm sure everybody else has experienced, but I think for us, the interesting thing is that one of the huge advantages of this team has always been that it's very diverse, and it's likely more diverse than the typical, let's say, startup team that you would have, because you need very different skill sets to succeed here. And you have a little bit of everything. And we've seen people really enjoy that and say no to, higher salaries in other, let's say, tech firms, because they felt that this is a bigger problem to solve, that that's more motivating to them, and also that the team is and the experience is very different. So you're thinking with other people who have very different backgrounds all the time. So that has always been a big advantage, and that actually, to some extent, it stayed with us after COVID, but also it did lessen, right? I mean, that power of, you come in and you share coffee with a biologist and whatever drug discovery scientist. So that did lessen, and so we needed to think about how we solve that. But in general, we've heard from especially the biotech folks that, the veteran biotech folks who got into the team, that we've really weathered the storm really well, and actually the team and the interactions are way more interesting and way more motivating than what they're used to, even at pretty leading biotechs that they have spent some time in. So I think that's a positive.
Awesome. So we talked a lot about kind of your challenges related to the business model and the strategic direction. I mean, these are pretty heavy things, but are there any other challenges that you've had, even just in, building the company, growing the team as a leader, as a CEO, from your experience, just, being a founder, that you learned, what are the biggest kind of lessons that you've learned, I guess, in the Turbine?
Yeah, I think this comes back to partly this whole notion of the tripod and how we strive for consensus, absolute consensus, rather, initially in the first number of years. So I think that had a lot of benefits, but also actually it had a lot of difficulties, right? Because we basically built an organization that didn't have clear areas of responsibility, where people couldn't really call the shots in their own sections of the org, which slowed things down, made it difficult, and actually introduced interesting dynamics to the team as well. And I think that was a major learning. So we were basically first-time parents in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And so we made a ton of mistakes as first-time parents. And I think we were always very introspective and strive for humility, which was a good thing. But early on, for a while, we basically felt that we had dynamics with the team that were almost like with children in a way. So, we took a lot of responsibility and we didn't ask them to take responsibility. And even because we always strive for, consensus among ourselves, the team didn't really know like who to listen to, right? I mean, this is my boss, but I need to ask those two other guys for their opinions as well before I can make a call. So we had a lot of that early on. And eventually we realized that that's not good. And we really started working. We did a lengthy, team coaching exercise with the founders to really help hash this out and bring some of the conflicts that have been lying around for years to the fore and to the surface. And everybody, I think, really did a good job on that, and that helped us really push the team in the right direction. We actually needed to let go of a couple of the early employees because we just couldn't fix the dynamics there. So that was a big learning for us.
Wow. Is there a more clear, I guess, division of labor now amongst the three of you?
Absolutely. So we completely rethought. I mean, for a while it was a running gag that we updated the org structure every year, at least once, and we did actually. But part of that was because we were going through these sort of growing pains of trying to figure out, how do we divide? Like, first up, we wanted to solve the wrong problem. We wanted to say, how can we, build an org where it seems that we've divided labor, but we haven't really, because everybody can still, have an opinion on anything that the other guy is trying to do. But then after that, we were then rehashing the org because we wanted to have a more clearer division between the teams. And also, obviously, we had to solve this interesting situation where you have, core, like research teams crammed in with, production development teams, crammed together with sort of internal users, because, right, our users are internal. So we have a complete suite of tools built around the simulations, but it's only internals who use them. And that was also difficult early on because if your paying customers are going to leave you because you haven't fixed the bug, that's different than if somebody near
your coworker,
your coworker just says that they're really having some difficulties, and it's sometimes harder to optimize for the latter than the former. So that's also something that forced us to really think creatively about how we build a product organization, divide that from research, and actually build sort of the users, like the user organization, drug discovery organization around that. And now we're going through another iteration. So we're going to completely rethink the org structure again.
Wow.
Because we're now a biotech company, and so a lot of legacy setups are legacy.
Yeah. And so what's your, I guess, how do you spend your time mostly?
Well, I guess, let's assume that you asked me this a month ago when I was not fundraising, but other than that, I think I spent a lot of time actually still balancing the forces. I think that's actually what we figured out. I mean, the founders, there was this big fear that, if we really divided labor and we said that, I as the CEO can actually call the shots ultimately, that will mean that I try to call the shots when I shouldn't be calling the shots, and I will be decreasing the authority that the other guys had or the responsibilities. And I may have wanted to do that, at one point, I think, when I was more junior. But now what I see is that because there are so many complexities to this organization, so many different viewpoints that need to be optimized for, I spend a lot of time trying to basically balance between the different viewpoints and to try to work with the executive team members to figure out the strategy that sort of optimizes for both what the product teams, the simulation needs, as well as what the drug discovery needs, and really still thinking a lot about the story and spending a lot of time with global experts trying to understand the market, the exit strategies that the others have used, and really learn from that. So I'd say that those are two, and then the third one is very much trying to think about, I'm not going to call it culture, we don't really think about it that way, but I'd say trying to be very introspective and be very open about where I fall short and where I struggle, and just try to inculcate that into the team and that attitude.
Awesome. So we're about winding out of time here. I just have one last question for you. What would be your last bit of advice? So we have a lot of startup founders who listen to this podcast. So what would you tell them to stick with it, or when they're in times of struggle? What's the message you want to leave with our audience?
That's a good question. I say that there's really two. One is the less personal advice or like just suggestion, or I don't know, request, plea. So that is that it would be great to have more founders try to tackle sort of deep tech problems or core scientific challenges. There's a whole host out there, right? I mean, we have climate change, we have food shortages, all that could be solved by applying some kind of foundational science and bringing that to the market in a smart way. So I think that it's just extremely interesting to work on this company. I loved working with Tresore, but it's so different when every day you're faced with cool scientific challenges and you're trying to think through these problems. I think it's a very rewarding experience. It's very difficult, especially today from Hungary, but I'm sure myself, my co-founders, and the whole host of others who are trying to build companies like this would be very happy to help whoever really wants to start out on this road. So that's one. And the other, in terms of personal struggles, well, I'm not going to say that I've cracked that problem. And obviously, fundraise and going through all this long trajectory definitely had a lot of downs, right? I mean, a lot of difficult situations. I mean, personally, I know that there's no stigma attached to this anymore, I think, in our generation, but just to be very honest about it, I mean, I've been, for example, going to therapy for 6 years now. And now, I've done a lot of coaching as well, and I spend a lot of time trying to be introspective. I mean, I would love to say I meditate a lot. I try to, but it doesn't really happen. But I mean, what I've learned is that even though I'm really bad at putting myself first, I try to do that more, and just the therapy, just more time spent, or just a bit of time spent on whatever movement or training every day is what actually helps me. And it's really hard to optimize for that, especially now, for example, in Fundraise. But even though that, I try to do it. And maybe one final comment, and this is also something that's personally something I care about a lot now and I try to do better at, and that's to rewrite your own internal narrative. And this is very personal. I'm sure a lot of people don't struggle with this, but I found that over the years, I've benefited a lot from, me personally being motivated to, in a way, avoid the apocalypse. Let's just put it that way, right? I mean, every time I look at, my situation or the company, I'm not freaked out by the challenges, but I definitely see much more of the problems, potential ways that this could go wrong, than the good things, and how much we've already achieved. And so that has helped me stay extremely motivated and push really hard over the years. But this year I've actually made a conscious effort to try to rewrite that narrative and say that we've already achieved so much and that we can be proud of. And I think in the next phase of the company, it will be better served by me not being motivated by that sort of fear, but much more motivated by just being sort of brave and saying, this is super hard, and if it doesn't work out, it's fine. I mean, it's more likely not to work out, just statistically, and it's fine because it's worth trying to do it here in Hungary and to solve this specific problem.
Better to dream big and
and then to really go at it, right?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so many gems here. Thanks so much, Szabi. This was a really great conversation. And thanks for your honesty. And yeah, it was really great to get to know you. Take care.
Same here.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe so you'll be notified when we release new episodes. Tune in next time as we continue to deep dive and uncover more hidden gems in the Untold Stories podcast. Check out our show notes for more resources about the topics we discuss and anything we mentioned during the podcast. Let us know what was your key takeaway from today's episode. And if you found this content useful, please feel free to share it with anyone else you think would benefit from it.